Well, good evening or good morning or good afternoon, my lovely students. We have one more thing that we have to talk about before we wrap up this unit on the Industrial Revolution. One more thing that we have to talk about before we can take our test. And it seems obvious. I mean, we've talked about how the Industrial Revolution brought society all these neat things and how it transformed society. But we've talked a lot about the negative sides of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, we've talked about slums, we've talked about terrible working conditions, and it's time that we put some closure on that. I mean, these things don't happen in a vacuum. There has to be some type of response to this. And so now what we have is the beginning of something called the class struggle in the Industrial Revolution. In other words, there's people who work in factories in miserable conditions. They're going to get darn fed up with the whole situation, and they're going to react. And so we have to talk about this reaction. Now, the Industrial Revolution caused this mass urbanization, and we've done a little work with that in terms of where we live here in Sunbury and how it's changing. But I don't think that people in Sunbury are living the way these folks did. I'm sure there's some, but not many. This is a photograph. Now, it's not from England, but it's from the United States, and it shows you the way people lived in slum-like conditions during the Industrial Revolution. These massive buildings housed tons of families. And if you look, they have all their laundry out there hanging out to dry, which, you know, makes use of the wind. But these were not nice places. Cramped, crowded, depressing. And when you live in those circumstances and when you work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, you can get pretty darn bucky, which is what people became, especially when you're not paid very well. So these slums, this is a good picture of the slums that were created as a result of this mass migration of people to the cities. Now, this is a really, really interesting term. I mean, Charles Darwin is the biologist who came up with the theory of evolution in 1830s when he visited the Galapagos Islands in just off the coast of South America. And Darwin's theories were controversial at the time, but they really struck a chord with a lot of people because they made sense. I mean, you see it in nature all the time. The survival of the fittest. In other words, the ones who are best adapted to their environment prosper. Now, the tricky part about this is people began to apply this biological concept to human behavior. I love this image right here. You got this rich snot on the left, and you got this poor beggar on the right, and the poor beggar's asking for money, and the rich snot's looking at him like, I ain't giving you my money, buddy. And there's this incredible disdain on the, negative feelings on the part of the dude on the left. In other words, he's looking at this guy thinking, hey, you're largely responsible for your own situation. So the crux of social Darwinism is you look at poor people and you come to the conclusion that they are largely responsible for their circumstances. And it doesn't make you very empathetic to what they're going through. Okay, now here comes Karl Marx. Karl Marx. Karl Marx is one of the most significant people to have lived in the last 300 or 400 years. He was a German dude, lived from 1818 to 1883. He is credited with coming up with the philosophy that spawned communism, which, there's still some communist countries in the world today. China is technically communist. Cuba's communist, North Korea's communist, and Vietnam is technically communist. But, 50 years ago, a good part of the world was communist. So this is a very significant individual. Now, he is going to throw out some terms which are really important. Bourgeoisie, the first time we saw bourgeoisie was during the French Revolution. And these were members of the Third Estate who were wealthy and who were doctors and lawyers and business owners. And that hasn't changed, except for now the bourgeoisie is on top. They're the owners of the means of production. Now the workers, the people you saw living in those tenements, are called the proletariat. And so what Karl Marx saw was this very, very tiny group of people right here that own things, and this mass group of people right here who ran things. And these people were being exploited by these people. In other words, they're getting paid very little, and these bourgeoisie types are just reaping mass quantities of money. So Marx saw these two classes, the owners and the workers. Now what he proposed was to create a classless society where the following took place. People would be paid according to their need, and they would be expected to work according to their abilities. To each according to need, from each according to ability. If you look at that phrase, if you write that phrase down, that's the summary right there of communism, Marx's ideas. Now there's some big problems with this, as the world has learned, as we're going to learn shortly. But from a humane standpoint, it is logical. You know, you want to, if somebody needs something, you give it to them, and you just ask them to work to their abilities. That's the whole crux of it right there. And Marx saw this history as just this big class struggle. Okay, now this is interesting. When Americans think of competition, they tend to look at it in a favorable way. Look, if your cable company has a monopoly, they're not going to work very hard to try to please you because they have no competition. If there's competition, your cable company has to work hard to please you. In other words, competition brings out the best in us. I mean, I think most of us understand that mindset. Probably most of you agree with that mindset. But Marx looked at competition in another way. He looked at these two characters right here that are fighting with one another. In other words, competition brings out some of the worst in our nature. And there's reason to think that too. I mean, go to a youth sporting event and see parents absolutely spaz out. I had offspring who played sports, and I know the way I got when I watched them play. So competition can bring out the very worst in us. In other words, business owners might feel like they can cheat their workers by paying them dirt wages or making them work in unsafe working conditions. So Marx thought that competition was ultimately an evil thing, very negative. He believed it brought out the worst in human behavior. In other words, down with competition. I like that big transparent thumb. Okay, so what did Marx, what's the problem with Marx's theory? Well, it's simple, people. It's called incentive. If you don't know what incentive is, it's just a reason to do anything. And under Marx's ideas of to each according to need, from each according to ability, the problem is people just don't have a reason to work very hard. If I have 3 kids and I'm going to get, $300 a week, and Johnny over there's got 7 kids and he gets $700 a week, I'm going to become resentful of that, particularly if Johnny sucks as a worker. So the problem with communism, and this is the huge problem, is it's just not very productive. It doesn't motivate people to do things. It doesn't give them incentive. I love this image here of this like idiot guy with a stick hanging off his head that he's obsessed with this money sign. He's going to move forward. Of course, he doesn't realize that the money's going to move forward too. Some people aren't too swift. But here's the thing that's interesting. Marx scared the you-know-what out of a lot of people, because people were thinking, oh boy, during the French Revolution there was this massive bloodletting, and that could happen again, and everybody that owns a factory, everybody that owns a business could be in a lot of trouble. Good fear. But here's something that happened at the end of the Industrial Revolution that people were not prepared for, that was hugely impactful. The development of labor unions. Now we're going to do something tomorrow called the collective bargaining game, in which we're going to work on this a little bit. But once unions were created, the sole focus of unions, or I should say the dual focus of unions, was better pay and better working conditions. Now by unionizing, it gave workers power to try to push for these things, and to a large extent these things came about. And as a result of the union movement, people tended to look at that as an answer as opposed to the more radical answer, which is communism. And we're going to talk a lot about communism next semester when we talk about the Cold War. Okay, people.